I really am pleased to honestly say that Lord Christopher Monckton is an extraordinary individual. I'm privileged that he is a personal friend of mine and worked very closely with him for several years now. And just one quick plug there. We have, he spoke in Cambridge, and we filmed it in high def, made a motion picture out of it. We've edited it down. Any of you who want a copy of his presentation at Cambridge on this extraordinary subject, please contact me afterwards. I'll get your card and I'll send you a free copy of it. I'm going to hit just the highlights from the ALEC program that they have put together for his bio so that he can begin speaking. Lord Monckton was a special advisor to Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher when she was Prime Minister of the UK from 1982 to 86. His contributions to the IPCC's fourth assessment report, the UN's report, earned him that famous Nobel Prize laureate sharing because of his correcting a table that had been put in there that magnified the numbers by tenfold, and he caught it and corrected it. He has lectured to undergraduates at Cambridge Union Society on climate change, which we filmed. He's spoken to universities around this country. He's testified before this year before two committees of our U.S. Congress. And I will say without any melodrama that for those of you who are not too familiar with this issue, your lives will be changed after this talk. You'll never see this issue the same. You'll never see the situation, the threat to this country the same. Christopher Monckton has probably one of the most extraordinary appreciations for our founding fathers and respect for and love for our country of any person I've ever met outside this country. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Lord Christopher Monckton.
Senator, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, after that wonderful, glowing introduction, I just can't wait to hear what I'm going to say. Now, it is an enormous honor and privilege always to visit this great country. And when I heard the prayer at the beginning of breakfast, first of all, I thought, hooray, there is a prayer, because you still respect the constitutional provision that says that Congress shall make no provision for an establishment of religion, and that means we are still entitled to pray wherever and whenever we want. And I'm delighted to hear that, because in the UK we are no longer as free to do that as you still are here. And I was also very moved when the gentleman who kindly led us in prayer this morning said how proud he was of this great nation of yours. I too am proud of it. I'm grateful for it. I'm grateful for the long and happy relationship that Britain has had the honor to have with it. And so it is a particular pleasure for me to be here with you all today. Now, the topic of my talk is a rather blunt one. It is, will America abdicate? You are, for now, the leaders of the free world, and indeed the leaders of the rest of the world that would like to be free, and they look to America as the beacon of liberty. But at Copenhagen this December, there will be a huge United Nations jamboree. Your president is going, Al Gore is going, James Hansen is going, all the usual suspects will be there, and the intention of those who are organizing that particular event is to destroy the American Constitution forever, because they will be asking all the states parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to sign up to a treaty by which, for the first time, they will give away their national sovereignty to a world government. It won't be called a world government, but it will be the first step on the road to what could very easily become a world government. And as we know in Europe to our cost, supranational government is not democratic government. It doesn't believe in liberty. And so you, after just over 200 years of freedom, may be bringing your constitution to an end, and I put it as strongly and bluntly as that, within the next few months. And it is in that context that I want to talk to you about whether there is any basis for doing any such thing. Now, at the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they probably would not call a spade a spade. They would call it a one-person operated, manually controlled, foot-powered implement of simple and robust, yet adequately efficacious lignometallic composition, designated primarily, though by no means exclusively, for utilisation on the part of hourly paid operatives deployed in the agricultural, horticultural, or constructional trades or industries, as the case may be, for purposes of carrying out such excavational tasks or duties as may, from time to time, be designated by supervisory grades as being necessary, expedient, desirable, apposite, or germane with regard to the ongoing furtherance of the task or objective in hand, or, on the other hand, underfoot Secretary-General. Now, the problem with global warming is that the UN has managed to make it complicated when actually it's very simple. Global warming has happened before, it will happen again. It isn't actually happening at the moment. It's been cooling for 8 years, as we'll see. But it is not a problem. In order to make it a problem, they have had to complicate several simplicities, and we are now going to remove the complications and get back to the bare facts. So let's begin with this UN graph. Now, this graph really tells you all you need to know about whether the UN is intending to give you straight science or something that has been bent. Now, the vaguely defined blue area underneath is the actual trend in temperatures over the last 100-odd years. And then you'll see a series of railroad lines over the top. And they are intended to demonstrate that the nearer you get to the present, the steeper the rise in temperature is. You'll also notice that the actual temperature line jiggles up and down a lot. It's what scientists call a stochastic data set. You don't know which way it's going to jump next. Now, it is an essential characteristic of stochastic data sets that if they jump up and down like that, the choice of start points and end points for the linear regression trend lines that you see there will dominate, and you can therefore make the apparent direction of change go in any direction you want. And that is what they've done here. It is a completely bogus graph. And yet that graph is cited in the EPA's decision to regulate CO2. It's cited by Rajendra Pachauri, who's the chairman of the IPCC, as the basis for saying that matters are getting rapidly worse, we're getting an accelerating problem. And now let's prove that it really is bogus. Here what I've done is to choose 4 start points, 1997, 2001, 2005, and each successive start point 4 years later than the previous one. And you'll see that the first of those 4 graphs, going back sort of 18, 20 years, shows an increase at apparently 3 Fahrenheit per century. Then if you bring it forward 4 years, it comes down to +1. Bring it forward another 4 years, it comes to -2. Bring it forward another 4 years, -10 Fahrenheit per century. We're heading for an ice age. Well, of course, we're not. All I've done is to use exactly the same statistical trick as the UN used on exactly the same data, and a more recent area of the data at that, and I have produced a completely opposite result to that which they would have you believe. So what we're looking at is deliberate falsification of the data, and after all, the temperature data is the most basic data you can get in all this if you're talking about global warming. Deliberate falsification of the data over and over and over again in the official documents, not only of the UN, but also of the US Climate Change Programme, the EPA. They are all at it. And the press, which is supposed to be the guardian of our liberties and is supposed to stop them, simply parrots every piece of nonsense they peddle, and most newspapers, with the honourable exception of Fox News, and I hope the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, is not printing the truth. And so I hope that now we will start to get to the truth. Here is that same graph. This time we have the true temperatures in yellow. And what I've done is to put on 3 parallel pink lines there, and you'll see that those slopes are identical. So what we've had is 3 warming phases, each of around 25 years, at exactly the same rate of warming at each other over the past 150 years. There has been no acceleration in global warming in our own time. Everything we have seen is merely a continuation of the recovery of temperatures worldwide since the end of what was called the Little Ice Age, when for 70 years there were no sunspots on the sun, a lot less solar irradiance arriving here, and it got cold. The Thames and the Hudson both used to freeze over every winter. Both sides of the Atlantic experienced this, and ever since then, temperatures have simply been recovering. They are still not as high as they were in the medieval warm period. Here is the UN's graph in which they tried to abolish the medieval warm period. There, on the left, you will see no great hump in temperatures, which is what actually happened. Instead, you'll see on the right a supposed record of actual temperature increase over the last 100 years. That's the line that's in red on the right there. That line has been exaggerated by 50%. And that document was published 6 times, large and in full colour, in the 2001 report of the UN's climate panel. Once again, flagrant distortion of the data, in this case in 2 directions. One, to abolish the medieval warm period, which history and 700 scientists contributing to 400 papers from 400 institutions in 40 countries have established in the last 20 years, was a real phenomenon, just as history relates. So there was a medieval warm period. The UN, in order to try and make out that we now have a crisis, had to pretend that there wasn't. And so they not only abolished it, they then multiplied by an extra 50% the actual increase in temperature over the 20th century, so as to produce this entirely bogus hockey stick-shaped graph. And even though this graph has been demolished in the scientific literature, the UN still adheres to it to this day. It is not willing to listen to real science. It is there to peddle a particular propaganda line. And what are the consequences of this? The consequences are that people are going hungry. 1/3 of all the agricultural land in the United States has been taken out of cultivation to grow food over the past 2 years. 1/3. And it is now growing not food for people who need it, but biofuels for automobiles that don't. And all because of the global warming scare and the biofuel scam that has been bolted onto it. And let's look at one of your neighbouring countries, Haiti. That is a picture of a man from Haiti selling mud pies that are made with real mud. That's what they eat in Haiti if they're poor. And I was telling this story of what has happened as a result of the doubling of world food prices, which is an inconvenience for us. You know, you pay $25 for a breakfast and it was $12.50 2 years ago. Okay, we can cope with that. But if you're poor and $25 is kind of somewhere between a month's and a year's income, you can't afford a doubling of food prices, and so you starve. And there have been major food riots in 12 separate poorer regions of the world over the last 18 months. And I'm going to ask, hands up, how many of you have seen any of those food riots reported in any news medium of any kind here in the United States? As I thought, not one. You are not being told the truth about what's really going on in the world. Your media are grievously letting you down. And lest you think this is an attack on the American media, it isn't. This is a problem worldwide now that we have globalized, not thought, but groupthink, so that anyone who wants to point out inconvenient truths, like the numbers of people already being killed by starvation, not because of global warming, but because of the totally scientifically baseless global warming scare. These facts simply do not get reported. Now, here is what has actually happened to temperatures over the last 8 years, since late in 2001. I don't think many of you will have seen this reported either. Temperatures have been falling over the last 8 years at a rate more rapid than that steep rate of increase that I showed you occurring 3 times in the last 150 years. And that fall in global temperatures, you would have thought might have raised a few questions in the minds of the media. It has gone almost entirely unreported, whereas speeches by James Hansen, Al Gore, Rajendra Pachauri, and all the usual suspects about how global warming is getting worse and accelerating are faithfully reported, even though there is absolutely not a shred of scientific or real-world evidence for any such contention. Then they talk about how Arctic sea ice has been declining. As you will see, it follows what is more or less a sine wave, which is dictated chiefly by the distance of the Earth from the Sun and the obliquity of the Earth's axis and the seasons. And the red line, which you can barely make out there on the slide, is this year's trend. And you'll see that it's bang in line with the trend over the last 10 years. And maybe this summer we will see a temporary loss of some sea ice, as we did in the last 2 summers. So what? Ice comes and goes in the Arctic. There's nothing new about that, nothing particularly exciting about it. You can't read anything into it. The one thing we do know is that the record low sea ice extent in the Arctic that happened in 2007 could not have been caused by global warming, because for the last 8 years there hasn't been any. And it really is blindingly obvious, therefore, that whatever caused the temporary loss of summer sea ice in the Arctic in the last couple of years, it can't have been global warming that caused it. These are elementary points that you will not see in your mainstream media. Here is the Antarctic sea ice record, and you will see it reached a peak high extent in October 2007, 1 month after the very widely reported low extent of sea ice in the Arctic. And I bet you that you all have seen the report of the low sea ice extent in the Arctic that happened that summer, and very few of you will have seen reported that 1 month later there was a record high sea ice extent in the Antarctic, because this inconvenient truth once again didn't fit the message. And here, if you take global sea ice extent, is the entirely regular heartbeat of the global sea ice. It's a seasonal heartbeat combining the northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere sea ice. This is produced by one of your universities, and it is showing virtually no trend whatsoever for the entire 30 years during which satellites have been able to give us enough data to produce this graph. There is the objective scientific data in front of you. So every time you hear these bedwetters talking about how sea ice is melting and this is a proof of global warming, it simply isn't happening, and there are the facts in front of you now. Hurricanes. You will hear Al Gore ascribing everything from Hurricane Katrina to Cyclone Nargis to global warming. So let's have a look at the actual trend in the combined frequency, intensity and duration of all the tropical cyclones, typhoons and hurricanes around the world over the last 50 years. And at the right there, at the bottom, you will see that that accumulated cyclone energy index, as it is called, has reached a new record low just in the last few months. You will not have seen that reported anywhere else. All I'm giving you is real-world data. All of this is easy to verify and easy to find once you know where to look. None of this is made up by me. All of this comes from the real world. Now, here is the trend in CO2 concentration over the last 8 years. It is rising. We are almost certainly largely responsible for that rise. But it doesn't actually make very much difference to temperatures, as we've seen, because the temperature graph was going in completely the opposite direction. And you'll see that blue zone above the line where the data is. That's where the UN imagines the increase in CO2 should be going. But it isn't happening. Even despite record emissions of CO2, the concentration that remains in the atmosphere is rising at only half the rate that the UN has predicted. That circumstance on its own requires that all of the UN's forecasts for the human effect on temperature over the current century should be divided by 2. And the moment you divide them by 2, you cease to have a problem. That one graph clearly tells you that. Here it is extended out to the year 2100. You can see how the UN is predicting what is called an exponential rise. The rate of increase itself continuously increases. That's why you get that upward curve in their projections. The straight line, which the data are actually following, comes out a long way below the central estimate of where the UN thinks things are going to be as far as CO2 concentration is concerned in the year 2100. And then you hear an awful lot about sea level rise. The only danger to sea level rise is from all those bedwetters, because sea level has been rising for something like 1 foot per century over the last couple of centuries. There's been no real change in the rate of rise. In fact, over the last 3 or 4 years, it hasn't been rising at all. And this graph, which I've just downloaded from the university which publishes it, has not been updated for the whole of the last 12 months. And I suspect the reason for that is that they're desperate to conceal the fact that sea level may even be falling a little at the moment, and they certainly don't want that to be known before the Copenhagen conference. It doesn't, once again, fit the message. And the problem here is the data are saying one thing, and the media and the politicians and the scientists and all the others who are making a fortune out of this scam are saying something quite different. Here is sea temperatures as measured by the 3,300 Argo automated bathythermographs that are deployed all over the world, and you will see that the trend is actually very slightly downwards over the last 5 years. The oceans have been cooling. This is the top 400 fathoms, roughly speaking, of the oceans worldwide. This is a reasonably reliable measurement, subject only to a few problems with calibration because the technology is new. But if this is right, and broadly speaking the consensus in the scientific literature is that it probably is right, then this one graph shows that the theory of global warming is definitely, unquestionably false, because it is agreed among all scientists looking at this subject that if there were any warming going on, it would have to happen in the top 400 metres of the ocean. That's where 80% of all the extra heat trapped in the atmosphere would have to arrive. So how are they getting it so wrong? When I was first approached 3 years ago by one of our merchant banks to tell them whether global warming really was a problem, because their analysts were baffled by the conflicting points of view that were being expressed, the first thing I wanted to know was the radiant energy from the sun, which gets trapped by these greenhouse gases, is measured in watts per square metre. And temperature is measured in degrees Kelvin by scientists, about 1.8 Fahrenheit per degree Kelvin. And I wanted to know how to convert the watts per square metre into degrees Kelvin. It's a natural question, isn't it? We're trapping this extra radiation. What's it going to do to temperature? How do we find out? Well, there is a fundamental equation of radiative transfer, the Stefan-Boltzmann equation. There it is in front of you now. That, without this equation, you cannot do this sum. You can't work out what effect there's going to be on the climate. So I went right through the 2001 UN report, 1,000 pages of it. It tells you all you need to know about the climate. This equation is not mentioned anywhere. So I looked at the 1,500 pages of the 2007 UN report. This equation is not mentioned even once. Now, why not? Well, this entirely clear slide will explain why not. The reason why not is that if we do a very simple thought experiment, which the result of which is on this slide here, what we're going to do is take a deep breath and hold it for a bit, because we're going to remove the entire atmosphere from this planet. And then we're going to work out what its temperature is. We're going to use this equation, which tells us immediately that the temperature would have been about 17.6 Kelvin, that's around 30 Fahrenheit, cooler than today if there was no atmosphere. So the entire effect of having an atmosphere causes only 17.6 Kelvin of global warming. So if anyone comes along to you and says, well, you know, it could be as much as another 11 Kelvin of global warming if we increase the proportion of the atmosphere occupied by CO2 by 1/10,000th part of the atmosphere, you may begin to apprehend that they're simply bullshitting you, to use the technical scientific term. It is manifest nonsense. And this equation here simply shows me taking the UN's estimate of the climate sensitivity parameter and applying it to the difference between the Earth as it would be without an atmosphere and the Earth with one. And it shows that the numbers simply don't add up, and that the UN's climate sensitivity parameter, which tells you how much warming you'll get if you add a given amount of CO2 to the atmosphere, is around 4 or 5 times too big. So you take that together with the fact that they're overestimating the rate at which CO2 is accumulating in the atmosphere, and you get somewhere around an 8-fold to 10-fold exaggeration by the UN of how fast temperatures will rise in the current century. Remove that huge exaggeration and it is blindingly self-evident that there is no problem. However, there are various members of the current administration who would like you to believe that there is a problem, because otherwise they can't tax you and regulate you to death in the way that the Waxman-Markey bill intends. And one of these has proposed, it's an imaginative idea this, that what we need to do is to paint all our pavements and our roofs bright white, and that will reflect the sunlight back into space and save us from global warming. And the guy who proposed this is none other than the guy whom I call the Chattanooga Choo-Choo. Now, the Chattanooga Choo-Choo, Secretary Chew, he, like the locomotive after whom he is named, is really living in another century, goes backwards and forwards pointlessly over the same track, keeps on missing the points on the way through, and does it all with vast federal subsidies. Now, his calculation that painting the planet white will save the world from global warming has been widely reported. None of the facts I've just given you about what's actually happening in the real world, where there's no global warming and no problems and no hurricanes and no loss of sea ice, none of that is being reported. But the Chattanooga Choo-Choo and his proposal to paint the world white, that's had headlines everywhere. It shows you the state to which our media have sunk when a barking mad idea like this can be suggested. And so what I did was just a very elementary series of sums to work out, first of all, how much temperature we might be able to reduce. And if you painted 0.5% of the world's surface white, that's every rooftop, every roadway, all over the world, then you might be able to reduce the world's temperature by 0.2 Fahrenheit over the next 100 years. Now, since the UN says it's going to rise by 8 Fahrenheit, which we now know is more like 1 Fahrenheit, over the next 100 years, 0.2 Fahrenheit isn't going to hack it, but it is going to cost you $50 trillion. Now, Secretary Chew relied for his intelligence on this on a scientific paper, which did a calculation similar to this, but being by scientists rather than by businessmen like you, what they left out was the fact that you have to paint 2 coats, otherwise it doesn't last, and you have to repaint white paint every 3 years, otherwise it just gets dirty again and it doesn't reflect the light back into space. They forgot all that. They forgot to include the costs of labour, which is quite expensive in the United States, and that's how they managed to try and make it out that this would somehow be a credible point of view. But that is nothing compared with the total absurdity of the Waxman-Markey bill, which would cost 300 trillion and would achieve practically no cooling of the atmosphere at all. So where does this leave us? It leaves us facing a very serious crisis, and it is not a crisis that has anything to do with the real climate. I hope I've shown that to you very clearly. What it does have to do with is the future of Western civilization. This great country is going to be asked to abandon its constitution in the only way in which it can, and that is by making a foreign treaty. It is only by making a foreign treaty that you can subject the US Constitution to control from outside. Now, those of you, Senator for one, who are legislators, took an oath of office to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. Now, Senator, I'm calling you out on that. You're going to have to do it, all of you, because your Constitution is going to go down the pan at Copenhagen this December unless all of you get together and lean upon the senators in Congress to make sure that they do not allow the Waxman-Markey bill to go through, and that if they are asked to ratify any treaty resulting from Copenhagen, they must, for the future of your Constitution, refuse to ratify it. And you do have, even if you are state senators and state legislators, great power over this matter, because you have the power to ask questions and insist on getting answers. I was recently telephoned by Senator Fielding from Australia. He holds the swing vote on this issue in the US Senate. And he is an honest man. He said, I don't know what the science is. I'm going to hear both sides. He heard the bedwetters first. Then he came to us in Washington, and he attended the Heartland Conference, and he met eminent scientists like Dick Lindzen from MIT, who knows more about the atmosphere than almost anybody else alive. He met Roy Spencer, who runs the satellites, Fred Singer, who set up the Satellite Weather Service. Eminent scientists, not one of whom believes in any of this rubbish. And he asked them questions, and they answered him straight and honestly and told him in every case where he could verify independently the answers they gave him. When he asked the bedwetters back in Australia, they gave him a string of lies, which he was able to check and find were lies, a lot of arrogance, a lot of propaganda, and no facts. And on the difference in attitude between the two sides, he was able to make up his mind. So I hope that you will use the power of the question, those of you who are legislators, and ask and ask and ask your federal agencies, and send their answers to me if you like, and I'll tell you whether they're telling you the truth or not. And anything I tell you, you'll be able to verify as easily as you can verify any of the slides I've shown you here. So I'm going to conclude now by saying how proud once again I am to be here in this nation which first fought against us for its freedom, and then gallantly fought alongside us for the freedom of Western Europe in the Second World War, and whose sons and daughters now fight alongside ours in freedom's far frontier, so that the world may be and become free. It is an honor to be here and a pleasure to be here, and in this hour of a crisis which is entirely a political one and not a scientific one, there is no scientific problem, I give you the words from your own poet Longfellow that Winston Churchill once gave to your president during the dark hours before the dawn in the Second World War. Sail on, O ship of state. Sail on, O Union, strong and great. Humanity, with all its fears, with all the hopes of future years, is hanging breathless on thy fate.
We do have time for a few questions. I think Lord Monckton is willing to take any. David Allman.
Yeah, you mentioned that the CO2 is going up. Is that a concern, and what is a prudent policy toward dealing with CO2 if it is a concern?
Open another bottle of champagne. The bubbles are composed of CO2. Have another piece of bread with your breakfast. The bubbles in the bread are composed of CO2. CO2 is an entirely natural trace gas. Even the UN's documents admit it as a trace gas. Its entire concentration in the atmosphere occupies just 1/10,000th part more of the atmosphere now than it did 250 years ago. It has a measurable effect on global temperature, but a very, very, very small one. We can afford, and indeed it happened in the past, if you go back to the Triassic era, 175 million years ago, I remember it well, there were, at that time, there was 20 times as much CO2 in the atmosphere as there is today. And it was in the Triassic era that the aragonite corals, the more fragile corals, first achieved algal symbiosis and came into being, when the CO2 content of both the atmosphere and therefore of the oceans was considerably higher, 20 times higher, than it is today. And there was no ocean acidification. There are very powerful scientific reasons why not the least of which is that if you do get, as we're not getting at the moment, some global warming from CO2, then the oceans will warm. That's part of the theory. If they warm, then by an elementary law of gases called Henry's law, which is 200 years old, it's well established, there's no doubt about it, then CO2 will be outgassed to the atmosphere from the oceans, adding very slightly to the total amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, but if anything, making the oceans slightly more alkaline rather than more acid. So there's no harm to the oceans from CO2. As to the land, of course, plants love it. It is plant food. And the rate of photosynthesis worldwide has been dramatically increasing. You can actually see this from space using satellites that measure the heat energy that's in the plants, and that's because they're taking up the CO2 and by photosynthesis converting it to sugar, which they feed themselves with. And this is going at an accelerated rate. There's certainly no harm to humans. You can actually put CO2 in the atmosphere up to 10,000 parts per million compared with less than 400 at the moment without the slightest harm to any creature on the planet. So the only harm that could in theory be done is if this were to cause a great amount of global warming. But as I've said, if you do that simple experiment, you take away the atmosphere, measure what the temperature or calculate what the temperature of the Earth would be, then add back the atmosphere, you're adding only 17.6 Kelvin of warming for the entire atmosphere. So the idea that a tiny, tiny perturbation in the composition of the atmosphere, which is all that we could possibly achieve before fossil fuels run out altogether, is going to have a major effect on temperature is simply barking mad. There is no basis for it, and therefore nothing to worry about.
Is it true that you've challenged Mr. Gore to a TV debate, and for $1 million that he has or has not responded?
I have certainly challenged him to a TV debate. I have taken out adverts in all the major newspapers that ran for several months a couple of years ago. He didn't even deign to reply. When I tried to answer his testimony in the US Congress, Waxman and Markey decided that for the first time in the history of Congress, the chosen witness of the elected minority would not be heard. So freedom of speech is another casualty of this global warming scare. I went anyway and tried to shake Al Gore by the hand and was pushed aside by his goons. So I think you can take it that he is frightened to face me in debate. Now, I wonder why that could be. Could it be that the inconvenient truth is as I have shown it, and he, in his heart of hearts, knows it?
Right, I'll ask.
Yeah.
Some of the alarmists talk about destruction or devastation of local ecosystems around the world and certain species within those ecosystems. They blame it on global warming. Could you address that particular issue?
Happily. Yes, there are something like 1,000 different attributions of global warming to various real or imagined environmental problems around the world. However, if you remember that graph of what has actually been happening to global temperatures over the last 8 years, would you conclude from that that there was any problem happening anywhere in the world as a result of global warming? No. That's the significance of the fact that in the last 15 years there has been no statistically significant global warming at all, and in the last 8 there has been global cooling. Therefore, you cannot ascribe any current event in the climate or the biosphere to global warming because there isn't any, and it really is as simple as that.
In your opinion, what is the motivation behind this big push for climate change? They spent a lot of money, a lot of political capital in criminal investigation. The theory is you usually follow the money. But could you give us an opinion of why all this effort is going into this?
Certainly. It is money, power, and glory. I've been invited to speak at a Congress of lawyers from Asia in Singapore next May. And I was invited by a very distinguished judge from your Hawaiian Circuit Court, Patrick Border. And he said, by the way, Al Gore will be going. Do you mind? I said, not at all. I've been trying to get a debate with him for years. And I'll be happy to appear on the same platform or on a different platform, however he wants to play it. I don't mind. I'm very relaxed about all of that. And they said, do you know how much the Singapore government is going to pay him? And I said, no, I'd be intrigued. And he said, $300,000 for one speech full of lies. So I said, hey, for $300,000, I'll happily come. And they said, oh, no, that's not how it works. He gets $300,000, you get nothing. So the money is all with the global warming faction, because now governments worldwide have bought into this because it is a wonderful way of raising taxes and increasing regulation and making the worst kind of legislator feel self-important. And it is also an issue which the international Marxist left picked up the moment, to their great regret and to our delight, the Berlin Wall came down. They all piled into the Green lobby. And I know one of the founders of Greenpeace, Eric Ellington, and another one who has also come out publicly and said, well, Eric has said to me privately, is Patrick Moore, and two of them, they both resigned, along with a number of the other founders of Greenpeace, within a year of founding it, because the Marxist left had moved in and taken it over. And this was years ago now, I mean, decades ago, because they could see that they could exploit the kind of feeble-minded, unquestioning environmentalism, particularly among young people, and turn it into an engine for the destruction of capitalism. Then you have school teachers who want to interest their children in something, anything, in the classroom. And by saying, we want to make you into climate change champions and report your parents for having too large a carbon footprint, you get children's attention. So teachers are naturally drawn to this. Academics are naturally drawn to it because they can make a fortune by saying, right, there's a serious problem here, give us lots of money and we'll make the problem go away. Yes, they will. They can just sit and drink because the problem isn't there anyway, so it'll go away all by itself. So they get richer. So what you've got is, if you like, a coalition of very powerful, vested interests, each of whom finds it expedient or profitable or politically congenial to ally themselves with this particular nonsensical cause. And it is always more difficult to command the headlines if you are trying to assert a negative. What I'm saying is, you haven't got a problem. It's not a terribly sexy message. It's true. But it's not going to sell that many newspapers. And so that's the difficulty one faces in trying to get people to confront the scientific truth. The media simply don't want to know, and they are the biggest vested interest of the lot. They will always sell more copies by saying world to end shock than by telling the truth, which is simply climate continuing changeable.
One more. Susan.
Are you seeing the whole movement run into trouble with the rebranding of the movement from global warming to climate change, and what's behind that?
Well, what's behind it is that most of the people who are, the very small number of scientists who are actually driving this scare by deliberately producing false data, there are not many of those, but they're very powerfully placed. Now, they are indeed, they know perfectly well that there isn't a problem. Most scientists know perfectly well there isn't a problem. We have a professor of the geophysical and atmospheric sciences in this room. If you ask him, is there a problem with the climate, he'll say no, there isn't. They know there is no problem. But they also know that the world is beginning to notice, after 15 years with no global warming, contrary to their theory, 7 or 8 years with global cooling, 5 years with cooling of the oceans, the one place where, if there was anything in this theory, the heat must be accumulating, and it is not there. So they started out by calling it global warming, and I've seen internal memos from people in Greenpeace saying we better stop calling it global warming because people aren't believing it. Let's call it climate change, and then whichever way it changes, we can say it's all because of global warming. We call it climate change. Then their memos changed after a year or so because that wasn't working either, because the climate has actually been remarkably stable over the last 15 years, so it hasn't really been changing much in either direction. So then they said, oh well, let's not call it climate change, let's call it energy security. And that's the latest term of art, and then no doubt next year that will become energy independence. And the year after that, then everybody will be calling it what it really is, which is absolute rubbish.
Thank you all so much for coming. I encourage you to pick up a brochure. If you don't support us yet, we've conveniently placed envelopes and brochures on the table for you. Please take one home and help us keep common sense in the debate over climate change and keep bringing such excellent speakers as Lord Monckton. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.